take this.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm fluent in multiple languages, but they are Java, C#, and Ruby. So I appreciate you listening to my English. Just out of curiosity, how many developers do we have in the audience? Okay, good. Yeah, that's what I am, and it's good to have a few others. Systems admins. Okay, I'm a little nervous. What I'd like to talk about today is open source, the big picture, and how systems monitoring fits into that from a business perspective. It's interesting because I've been following open source as an analyst for about 5-6 years now, and in 2009 was really when I saw from the data and from our client interactions that open source had crossed the chasm, that it had gone mainstream. And I want to share some of that data with you very quickly. So, everybody remember 2009? Not a very good year, right? Kind of feels like maybe it does now. But in 2009, because of the economic recession, most of the IT shops that I worked with found that they had budget cuts that they had to deal with. 10%, 15%, maybe more. And so everybody was looking for ways to save money and trying to figure out how they could do more with less. And one of the results of that was we saw a real change in behavior at the business level when it came to open source. In 2009, every year we survey IT decision makers, CIOs, VPs, and we ask them what their business priorities were. And in 2009, across 16 different priorities, the technology priority that popped to the top, the thing that was most important for them, was to expand or upgrade their existing implementations of open source software. More important than implementing business process management, middleware tools or mobile tools, using analytics, data services, every other category that we asked. So 2009 became the year of open source. And I saw a lot of that in the inquiries that I had with my clients. But by 2010, what we saw was that open source was dropping in its level of importance. It was no longer the number one thing that IT shops were looking to focus on. It seems a little counterintuitive, right? What's going on here? It's not necessarily what we would expect. Well, the reason that open source in 2010 and beyond has gotten less important in the minds of IT executives and business executives is because it's increasingly adopted in organizations now. When we survey large IT shops and ask them, well, how do you use open source? And at what levels do you use open source? We see that almost half use it at the programming language level, at the operating system level, at the development IDE level, at the database level, at the web server level, networking services. In fact, only 1 out of 5 organizations say that they don't use open source now. So 80%. So when you talk to the business executives and the IT executives that you work with, this is one of the first points to use. 4 out of 5 other companies are using open source in some way, shape, or capacity. So why should we be one of those 1 in 5 that doesn't? Everybody else is doing it. Why shouldn't we? Get them over the hump of other people aren't using open source. Now, there was another very interesting thing that happened in 2009 and 2010. Open source in IT used to be what I would call a don't ask, don't tell type of solution. We didn't tell management that we were using open source, and they didn't ask, okay? That's not the reality anymore. Management knows and increasingly approves of open source usage because of the value that open source brings into an organization. And we see this in our data. If you look at that same slide, the dark blue level is the amount of developers that told us that they were using various open source technologies. The gray bars are the managers at the same kinds of companies that now say they are aware of and using open source technologies. So in some areas, there's even higher management reporting now than there is reporting among developers or systems admins. So management's aware of what we're doing, and increasingly they approve. So again, you can use this data to convince your management that other managers know and are okay with the fact that open source is being used in enterprises. Some proof. Every year we do surveys around different types of products that are being used in IT shops. For the third straight year, in the middleware category, Tomcat is the #1 middleware server in the Java space. It's not even close when you look at commercial products like WebSphere or BEA, Oracle WebLogic. Number 2 is JBoss, another open source product. If you look at software configuration management tools, well over 50% of all development projects use an open source SCM tool. In the Java space, it's closer to 75%. 3 out of 4 development shops using open source SCM. 40% of developers that use Eclipse as their IDE use Linux as their primary development system that they work on. It's even higher in terms of the servers that they deploy to as their primary servers. If you look at build and release management, 4 out of the 5 of the most popular build and release management tools are open source. Hudson, Maven, Ant. And then on the consumer side, people said that Linux would never make it to the desktop, okay? Just wasn't going to happen. In reality, if you consider Android a Linux-based operating system, and I do, we're currently activating over 850,000 new Android phones worldwide every day. It's a lot of open source in the hands of a lot of consumers. So let's talk a little bit about the cost benefits of using open source and how you build an economic model to convince your management to let you use more and more open source. My recommendation is to focus on a very simple model. You can get very complex in calculating the ROI, but I think the simpler models do it just fine. So first of all, I'd like to introduce the concept of what I call the software iron triangle. There are 3 things that you can worry about when you're working with software: the cost of the software, the features and the capabilities that that software delivers, and the schedule through which you adopt it and roll it out. So in the open source world, what I see is that you choose 2 of those points, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing open source or commercial, the other one has to vary. It's very difficult to be able to get all 3 or expand all 3 points at the same time. So open source tends to reduce costs, and it also accelerates the schedule. That's the 2 points that you tend to get most from an open source project. You don't always get all the features and capabilities of some of the commercial projects, at least right out of the box. And so open source is what I would call a Honda solution. Anybody here drive a Honda? Probably not in Europe, but practical car, Ford Focus maybe, okay? We don't like Ferraris, right? Okay. The reality is a Ford Focus or a Honda is often the right car for the majority of people because it gets you from point A to point B very quickly, and it's a very high quality, a very reliable solution. Commercial products tend to be Cadillacs or Ferraris. They have all the features. They're very high on the features and capabilities level. They're also, pretty easy to roll out. You buy the product and the company comes and installs it and, trains you how to use it, but they're not usually very cost effective. So that's the Cadillac end of the solution. The taxi end of the solution is when you outsource your systems management entirely to somebody else, or you use a software as a service, you just pay somebody else to take care of the product. It's like not owning a car at all. Well, the interesting thing about open source is I would say to you that I think adoption of open source is inevitable in every category of software, and that's because of what I call the open source paradox. So let's say that open source is a Honda, and it's competing against those commercial Cadillacs or Ferraris. Well, think about how those products evolve over time. Open source tends to get more and more capable over time as more features, as more plugins, as more capabilities are added. We also tend to see that over time, open source projects become higher and higher quality because the code is completely open to inspection by anyone. And so, much like a Honda, the open source solutions become highly reliable, and over time they become more capable. Now let's look at the Cadillacs and the Ferraris. Big companies like to sell these products. They have sales forces out there selling them, and to get that nice high price point to support the sales guys, those products have to have more and more features every release. They get more and more expensive. And sometimes their innovation slows down a little bit because they become very big and very heavy. And so what happens is you get to a point where the open source product gets better, the Honda becomes an Acura, it's still much more price competitive, and the commercial product either gets too expensive, prices you out, or the quality suffers, and you reach a plane where you see massive substitution, and open source products take over that particular share of the software market. IDEs. Eclipse was the Honda. A lot of Java commercial IDEs were the Cadillac. In the app server market, Tomcat is the Honda. WebSphere and Oracle App Server are the Cadillac. In the monitoring world, you will see the same sort of Honda Cadillac substitution take place at some point. It's probably already happening. So, in terms of a cost model, my general recommendation is a very simple formula. Total cost of ownership. Look at the capital expenses of acquiring and installing the monitoring product. Look at the operational expenses, either over a 3-year period, that's what I have here, or maybe a 5-year period. Take that total cost, divide it by the number of years, and that gives you a total cost of ownership. Now, there are some points to consider in that sort of economic model. Can you use commodity hardware? Often we find that commercial products might require a particular type of server that they have to run on. Sometimes those aren't Intel boxes, can't run in the cloud. That can push up the cost. Are the license costs a lump sum? Do you have to pay everything up front for the commercial product? If so, then you can be putting a lot of money out up front, not even sure whether that solution is going to be successful. With open source, your costs tend to be more realized over multiple years, mainly because of support costs if you pay for commercial support of those open source products. Are the software licenses perpetual or fixed term? So if you are paying for software up front, you've got to think about how often you have to repay for that software. Now, one of the most interesting points is with commercial software, you usually have to pay for support. You have no choice in order to upgrade. So you get locked in, and that's just something that has to be part of your budget on an ongoing basis. Open source products tend to be very different. You have the option of buying support, of working with a company that will provide you commercial support, but it is not required to stay compatible with the latest versions. That in itself creates a huge financial incentive to use an open source project because you have flexibility in what costs you decide to take on. Labor costs. In general, we find labor costs are as much as 10% higher when organizations use open source projects. The reason for it is simple. you generally have to have more skilled professionals who understand those products, who know how to do integration, are capable of going out onto the web and finding the information that they need, bringing it back, and integrating it into the solution. Now, that's good news for those of us in the audience that are systems administrators or developers or anything like that, but it is something that you have to factor into the cost of the equation. I would argue that more skilled, more experienced professionals are worth the extra cost, especially if in the end you can get away with fewer people, but it's something that you should understand going into looking at open source projects. Then there are indirect costs that you have to consider as well. When you look specifically at open source projects, one of the mistakes that we see organizations do is they just say one open source project is no different than another. Not the way you want to go. There are specific things that you want to look for when you look at an individual open source project. I generally recommend that you look at the current offering. How many features? What features does that project have? How frequently do bugs get fixed? How frequently do we get updated releases? How's the project governed? Is it run by a benevolent dictator for life? Or is there a foundation? Is there an organization? Is it run as the open core of a commercial company? How active is the community? How many participants? How many committers? How frequently do they make changes? Very important to assess the health of a project. License strategy. Is the license something that is commercially friendly, like a Berkeley license or an MIT license? Is it viral, like the GPL or the AGPL? That's something that may inhibit your ability to use or include those capabilities as part of products that you develop. And then what's the overall ecosystem? Can you buy commercial support if you decide that that's something that your management team would like to have as an insurance policy? So given those sort of requirements or ways to look at an open source project, let's take a look at some of the popular open source tools and see how they stack up. So there are hundreds of open source monitoring tools, utilities, frameworks out there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at 10 of them. Now, all the data that I have is collected from a site called Olo. You can go on that site. There's a lot more information that I'm not presenting here. You can run the charts and graphs. You can do your own assessment. I also recommend that you actually take a look at the projects and talk to the committers, talk to the organizations that are part of those tools, and find out what's really going on, as well as looking at the objective data. So with Nagios, very mature, very well-established code base, commits dating all the way back to 2002. Earned value. What this is the amount of code that the project is currently composed of divided by an annual cost of a developer. Olo sets a default value of $50,000 a year. I think that's low, but based on that, if you were to try to write all the Nagios code from scratch again, you'd have to pay developers about $3 million to do that. So there's money that your organization is potentially saving right there. In terms of user rating, the folks who use Nagios, who report on Olo about their satisfaction, give it a 4.1 out of a 5. If you look at where it's deployed, we see very strong usage, both in the US and in Europe, across all the different areas in Europe. Nagios has a very rich plugin model, as you know, and has very good ecosystem support. But one of the potential warning signs here is that if you look at the commits that have happened in the last 12 months compared to the previous 12 months, we see a decline in the number of commits. Not necessarily a red flag yet, but just something to watch as you continue to look at the health of Nagios overall. Also, if you look at the core of Nagios, there are commits from less than 5 individual committers right now. You take that, divide it by the overall code base, and each dev who's committing is supporting about 50,000 lines of code individually. If we compare that to Cacti, again, a very well, mature, established code base, something that's important to us in the enterprise. Earned value here is about $48 million. There's a lot of code in the Nagios repository, and I was talking a little bit to Jimmy about this. I think that number might be a little bit high because of the commit strategy and the different baselines that the project has that results in some double counting of code, but a tremendous amount of earned value in the Cacti project. OLO user rating of 3.9. Very strong user presence, not just in Western Europe, but we also see a lot of it in North America. We also see use in Asia as well. Huge number of commits in the last year. The peak was 351 commits in August of last year. I think it was done at a bar in San Francisco, right? But that's good. You like to see a lot of regular commits to the project. That means the project's alive. It's moving forward. I'll critique you a little bit, Jimmy. In terms of the ratio of comments in the code to lines of code tends to be a little bit lower score than some of the other tools. So you guys need to spend a little bit more time putting some good explanations into the code so folks can participate. But other than that, you've about 7 committers regularly committing to the code base itself, but good marks. What you want to see in a graph like this is you generally want to see a trending line that is either flat or upward. If the trending line is down, then that's an indication that that project might be losing a little bit of steam, and you might have a long-term support issue if you were to use that technology. Let's take a look at Shinken. As mentioned before, it's a relatively young project. We only started to see commits in about 2009, but if you look at the trend, it's moving upward very nicely. Now, in terms of the number of commits, we're seeing about as many as 300 commits in a month. Very good, healthy sign. Earned value here is a little bit lower because the code base itself is still somewhat small. Mainly, we see Shinken use in Western Europe right now. We don't see a lot of it in the US, and we're not tracking any in Asia. There might be some, but we just haven't run into it. 15 committers. That's a large number of committers for an open source project. So very healthy, at least right now, and growing. Very well commented source code in terms of the source code to code ratio. OpenQRM. Now here's an example of a project that may be headed in a different direction. If you look at the commit trends here, they're headed downward. And in fact, I don't think there have been any commits to OpenQRM in 2012 so far. So it does have a good, well-established code base. It's been around for a while, but it does have some decreasing commits. User rating's relatively high. Tends to be found a little bit less often. We don't run into as many users. Most of them are in Western Europe. The forums are pretty sparsely trafficked. You don't see a lot of new posts, a lot of requests for help, a lot of answers for help. So I would be a little bit cautious about making investments in OpenQRM, at least according to the numbers right now. Isinga, well-established code base, of course, because of the fork it built on Nagios and was able to kind of move forward. The earned value here, again, relatively high, 32 million. Take a lot of time to repeat that sort of code base if you were building it on your own. We tend to see a pretty high user rating, 4.6. Strongest in Europe, but we are starting to see some movement on Isinga use in the US as well. Again, a very healthy level of committers here, more than 15 committers. But there have not been as many committers this year as there were last year when we saw 15 different users committing to the project. Average, a little bit less than 200 commits a month, a very healthy overall level of activity. Zenos, again, a mature, well-established code base, about 17 million in earned value, OLO rating of 4.1. Tends to be stronger in the US than in Europe. We don't see it as much here. But if you look, and this is another warning sign, there's been a pretty marked decrease in the level of commits to Zenos in the last year. So there might be a little bit of a warning sign going on here. And this is indicative of one of the things we see around open source projects that are what I would call open core. They are something that an individual company is using and building on top of. There's a number of these in this space, and what we're starting to see is they are contributing less and less to the open source part of their projects and more to the commercial enterprise versions that they build on top of those core projects. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it does mean is if you want all the features. If you want the growing product, you're essentially buying the commercial product. You're not using an open source tool. So you need to understand the difference between a captive project and a project that is being run by a foundation or a community that commercial vendors are participating in, are building on top of, because this sort of declining commit in an open source project is something that can trap you back into the commercial market, essentially forcing you again to go buy Cadillacs. Hyperic, much the same. We see that same sort of trending downward in terms of the commits to the open source core of the project as VMware's developers continue to build out the enterprise version of Hyperic. Groundwork, again, a mature established code base, a lot of earned value, a pretty high user rating, but a marked decline in the number of commits since 2008. So a project that appears to be losing some steam. You also have fewer than 5 committers for a very large code base. If you look at those numbers, each developer has about 650,000 lines of code that they would have to cover in the size of the project. Pretty hard to maintain that code base, especially if you want to change it, if you want to update it, if you want to refactor it in any sort of significant way. So those would be warning signs for me. OpsView Core, again, pretty well-established code base, mainly used in Europe, not as much in the US. We're starting to see some commits increase in 2011, but we haven't seen as many in 2012. So it's not clear what's going on with this particular project. We've seen committers bump around a little bit from 3 to 5 and then back down. And again, I think that they're starting to do more for their enterprise project. Opennms, again, mature, well-established code base, a lot of accrued value, very highly rated, good usage in both Europe and in the US. Very steady commit rate, so very stable project moving forward on an even keel. A lot of committers, 16 is the high in 2011, 11 so far as of March, and very well commented source code as well. This would be a mark of a very stable project that is fairly reliable. So some general observations about these folks. And if there's any other project that you want to look at, you can go to OHLOH, O-H-L-O-H, and do the same sort of analysis yourself. But we see a distinct difference emerging between what I would call a waxing open source project, getting better, getting bigger, getting more popular, moving faster, and a waning project. The waxing projects right now seem to be Shinken, Cacti, Isinga. The waning projects, Zenos, Hyperic, and Groundwork. The others are kind of treading water. One of the things you need to ask yourself is what kind of open source solution do you want in your organization? Do you want a community-centric project that has multiple vendors participating, that gives you multiple ways to get value from that organization? Or do you want an open core product because you have a particular vendor that you would prefer to work with, you've got a single throat to choke, and you're okay buying commercial support? That's an important thing to look at. Watch for projects where the lines of code per developer are greater than 250,000. Because that's an indication of a potentially unsustainable code base and a project that might implode at some point. Watch for projects where the number of committers are below 5 because you're one catastrophic event away from seeing that project die. As you get over the 5 rate, there's a little bit healthier community. Folks leave, other people can come in and replace those committers. Think very closely about your ecosystem and how that ecosystem can enhance the product itself. I want to close just by looking at the financial impact that open source can have on an organization in the whole. I have many case studies, but because of the time, I only have about 4 that I'm going to use today for you. The first case study I have is a global financial services firm, one of the largest investment banks in the world. They have been using open source at scale since 2001, so well over a decade of use now. They started with Linux, and then they moved on to application servers. They've been using a number of open source network management utilities. What they found is that they were using their open source investments to keep their commercial vendors honest. They still do a lot of commercial software. They buy billions of dollars of commercial software a year, but they always keep the open source usage as a threat to those vendors to keep their costs in line. So even where they may not choose to do a substitution, they do use it to extract better prices. They also found that you need good developers, good system admins, not average ones. So they saw the labor cost issue crop up. They are now doing open source BI. The biggest problem they had was actually in the systems and administration group. A lot of your peers were afraid of what was going to happen when open source started creeping into the production environment and how they'd manage that, how they'd handle potential problems if they cropped up. The result, however, was that for every dollar that they put in to investing in open source through training, through commercial support, they found that they got about a 40% return on their investment. Tended to be very happy with that, and they've done that at scale. Another case study locally here from the Technica group. They needed a centralized network management system for the complete monitoring of their IT infrastructure. They wanted to manage full control over all of their worldwide subsidiaries, so they had multiple organizations they needed to manage. In this case, they used Würth's NetEye program projects to get up and running. The net result here was that they reduced their total cost of ownership by over 80% from the commercial Cadillac solution that they were using before. Another example, Sabre is the largest travel company in the US. I booked my flights to come over here through Sabre. And Sabre actually took an application that was running on a mainframe, and they rewrote it completely with open source, moved it to scale out Intel boxes, saved millions of dollars in the process. Running at scale, 6 million transactions per day. All their hotel system queries for scheduling now run through this open source system. Took them a couple times to get it right. They had to go to a messaging architecture. They're using a Mule open source bus. It did cost them more to train, to hire. One of the recommendations they would make to you is if you're just getting started with open source, it's worth buying support if it's available because it is nice to have somebody to call if you need help with configuration, with installation, with integration of open source components. As a result, they have saved tens of millions of dollars year over year in terms of their software infrastructure cost by moving toward an open source model. Last case study, again a local case study, Informatica Trentina. They've been using NetEye here since 2009. They've progressively replaced multiple modules of their commercial solution, and they're now supporting over 1,600 hosts and 10,000 services. Open source isn't just about the cost, though, because one of the things that we find is the level of flexibility that open source systems bring in. If you want to go to the cloud, it's not a big deal. You don't have to pay for a lot of additional licenses just so you can move to the cloud. That flexibility is something that comes up over and over in the research interviews that we do. Again, the net result here was a 90% decrease in the total cost of ownership from the previous commercial solution that they were using. So with that, I'd like to close with some best practices, assuming that you want to move forward and do more open source adoption in your enterprises. There's the role of an OSS steward. This is somebody who knows about licensing, who can work with a legal department, who can educate developers and system admins on what open source is like and the issues that they'll run into. You should have somebody in your organization that can understand the complexities of dealing with open source. You should create a policy, a 20-page or less policy that says, here's our policy for open source, here are the licenses we will accept, here's how we'll use it, here's the process for getting a project approved. That sort of thing. Fairly simple, but it should be something that anybody can read, anybody can acquire. Acquisition processes. We often see organizations adopting open source just simply because it's quicker to bring it in, get it installed, and use it. And purchasing processes for commercial software are so complex that people don't want to deal with it. That's not the reason you should be using open source software. So you have to also make your commercial purchasing processes easier, or you'll just get open source use by default. Project leaders should have to identify where they are using open source. If management is not aware, they should be made aware of all those sorts of libraries and frameworks that are already in use. Enterprise architecture groups can work with you to help make sure that the organization understands where open source is appropriate. So I'd encourage you to get involved with them. Also get involved with developers because they will be your allies in terms of using open source and promoting open source in your organization. Where you are including open source in services that you ship, especially if they are AGPL licensed, or if they are software that you're producing and shipping to partners or customers, make sure that you are doing some code scanning to make sure that all the potential dependencies that you have are identified so that you don't run into a risk where you have a GPL license that is being built into a product and all of a sudden you have to make that product available and open source it yourself. Don't expect perfection. There will be times when people will make a mistake in how they use open source software. Not something that you necessarily have to worry about as much in operations, but certainly something that we worry about in development. So having a plan for dealing with an open source violation is very important as part of your adoption process. And then you might want to actually contribute back to the open source projects that you're using. So you need to make sure that you have a contribution policy that specifies how your organization, your admins, your developers can actually make changes and submit those changes back to an open source project or write their own plugins or be part of that community. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much and open the floor to questions.
So thank you very much for the presentation. Please go ahead with the questions. Any questions?
I can't believe I didn't step on anybody's favorite open source management product with my slides.
It was a glass clear presentation. Good. Thank you very much.